Welcome to the Black Leadership and Social Impact Summit. Thank you for coming. Today, you are attending a panel discussion entitled Building Anti-Racist Teams. Before we go any further, let's acknowledge that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Métis, Inuit peoples as well. Land acknowledgement is one of the ways for us to recognize and honor the Indigenous communities and their traditional territories that we stand on today. It also helps increase the awareness of the ongoing presence and contributions of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I'd like to encourage each of us to continue on our journey to learn about the history and ongoing stories of Indigenous peoples where we live and work. On to introductions. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Nick Nurse, Senior Associate Social Impact and Corporate Citizenship at TD Bank Group. I manage the campaign sponsorship portfolios for Black History Month and music and ethnocultural festivals at the bank. For those who cannot see me, I'm a multiracial male and identify principally as Black, East Indian, and Indigenous. I have short, dark hair and I'm wearing a black shirt. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm joining this event from Toronto, Ontario. I will be your moderator for today's discussion. I'd like to introduce our panelists for today, starting with Karen Diop, Program Manager, Anti-Black Racism Action Plan at McGill University. Ikem Opara, National Director of Learning Partnerships at Rideau Hall Foundation. Neka Otogbolu, Director of Communications and Equity Strategy at Edmonton Community Foundation. And last but never least, Allison Dunn, founder of Pink Flamingo. Welcome, everyone. As I previously mentioned, today's workshop will focus on the topic of building anti-racist teams. It's not enough for workplaces and teams to be inclusive, diverse, and equity-based. Essential as these shifts are, to foster and support the extraordinary ideas and talent of Black leaders and change makers, teams must be actively anti-racist. What meaningful action can organizations take to get there? This is the question we wish to explore in today's session. As a reminder to our panelists, this is intended to be an open, organic discussion, and you're encouraged to chime in and actively share your perspectives. I'm just here to guide. I'd like to start off with the first question, and I think the best approach would be to do a roundtable because I'd like to get everyone's perspective on this first question. And this is it. We'll start. What has been your experience with anti-racism policies and or culture on teams and in workplaces?
I guess I can start. So for me, I guess the most difficult part is acknowledging that it exists in the first place, right? So you have instances where people or team members just assume because they have a Black neighbor or a friend, they're not racist. Sometimes it comes across as microaggression, sometimes the blatant comments made towards my person. And so, yes, it's not fun and it's not something that should be encouraged by teams. It's something that organizations should seriously frown upon and work towards eliminating.
Neka, can you provide, just to add a little bit more context to your comment, is what are some examples or one example of perhaps a comment, a passive aggressive comment, or perhaps even a racist comment that you've heard?
I could maybe make an instance when someone made a comment around honey is better at attracting, when there was a comment around some conversation around the Black Lives Matter movement that happened some years ago, the protest across the country, and someone made a comment around it would be better, or it's better, or it's easier attracting flies with honey than vinegar. So trying to say that the protest was not necessary and all that. And, luckily for me, the person doesn't work directly within my team, but it was just a passive comment on a project we were working on at that time. So, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's sort of making an assumption that everyone's on the same page in one regard, where it could be further from the truth.
Yeah.
I know I've
At that time,
experienced,
yeah.
comments that,
So at that time, I felt
go ahead.
it would have been appreciated if there was more empathy, right, to the cause than making such comment at that time. And being a member of the Black community, I felt targeted at that time with that comment because I was the only Black person in that room. And the person felt they were more informed or more knowledgeable, which I saw as being entitled. But then, yeah.
Mm. Thank
Yeah,
you
I would
for the
like to
feedback.
add
That's
to
great.
that. Yeah, I really like what you said about almost like treating us like a monolith. Like, not all Black people think the same way, not all POC think the same way, and so sometimes you'll have a situation at work, especially in your team, where there is another visible minority who's giving permission to some areas of white supremacy within the organization, and so that's the word that they subscribe to, instead of considering that there are other factors. Like, for instance, I represent a lot of different intersections. I'm Black, but I'm also Arab. So that's my mix. And I'm also a gay woman. So there's a lot of intersections of microaggressions that I experience often. And so my perspective on operations in a company and how I'm affected by the systemic kind of barriers is going to be different than somebody else that maybe looks like me but has a very different lived experience. So yeah, really focusing on individuality when it comes to dealing with anti-racism, I think, is paramount. But people really like to cut corners by overgeneralizing, grouping us, putting our experiences into acronyms, et cetera, when we have time and space to individualize experiences if we understand the concept of anti-racism. Instead of the rules of anti-racism, we need to conceptualize it.
I think the point that you hit on, being a multiracial woman, with many intersections, I can relate to as well. And it's really interesting, sort of, when you're hidden in plain sight, and you hear comments that are not copacetic and sort of irk you. And so I'm privy to that in a lot of situations where you don't appear to be what you actually are to people, and assumptions are made. And that's, I think, of used unintentionally or intentionally many times. Karen, can you tell us about some of your experiences with anti-racism on teams?
Sure. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Alison and Nika, for providing and sharing with us. Just to echo what you were saying, Alison, around like conceptualizing anti-racism in institutions in general and organizations. One thing that I've kind of observed is that, and you're probably well aware of that, there's a lot of fear and a lot of ignorance around how to do anti-racist work, especially within organizations and institutions. And one thing that I'm kind of always thinking about is, how do we allow for, in those spaces, for, how do we allow for deep conversation, true conversation, authentic conversation around anti-racism? And it's very difficult in general, in institution and organization, to create those spaces where people can be vulnerable. So I'm always kind of thinking, even before putting in place policies or working towards creating anti-racist spaces, my first question is like, are we all on the same page to allow for those conversations to flourish? How do we deal with resistance, for example? Because this is completely inherent to the anti-racist work in general. So these are kind of the observations that I wanted to share.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I find that, when you're reading the room, so to speak, in an organization, and I think there are different levels of where one would start in an organization. So, for example, at TD, where I work, we're very developed, we're very advanced in diversity inclusion, but in other areas, not so much, right? So we still have a lot of to do in terms of hiring Black executives, as an example. So there are a lot of gaps. In a smaller company just starting out, they may need to work from the bottom up. They may need the basic representation to begin with before they move on to other aspects, perhaps. So the approach might be different, I think, in dependent on the organization that we're talking about. Ikem, can you chime in and talk about some of your own experiences with anti-racism?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad to be having this conversation. I think our experiences, as I'm listening to you, they're very different, which kind of underscores the point is that even though we're talking about the same thing, the way we might experience it and the things that will trigger a return to that feeling of being othered or oppressed or being treated differently will come from many different places. I think in my experience that sometimes I am watching someone else experience the impact of the policies or the lack of education or empathy, like has been mentioned, that someone else within the same organization is sort of exhibiting. I think for me, where it has come up a lot is when we're trying to make policies or trying to make institutional change, and there can be a lack of consideration for who and how that policy will impact people. There's sometimes a separation between the theoretical, we're an organization that stands against all of these things, but then when you place that against actually making a policy or implementing the policy, that mission statement or that commitment or that tagline in your signature is forgotten in the process of rolling out that policy, and you end up actually perpetrating or recreating some of the same oppressions that you said at the beginning of your meeting or whatever that you stand very firmly against. Those are some of the spaces where I have seen racism show up in the teams and organizations that I've been a part of, and that's also makes it sometimes more difficult to counter, right? Because that motherhood statement that the organization has made is sometimes pointed at as this is the reason why we cannot possibly be racist, or we cannot possibly have policies and behaviors that are racist, right? Or that are recreating the same kind of racism and oppression that we see in society.
Would you say that, I know since the events of 2020 with George Floyd, when that came to be, I personally wasn't surprised. I know the history. I've experienced many things in my life. So for me, I think a lot of Black people have had the understanding that this was the status quo. Would you say within companies who since 2020 and even prior, when DEI sort of became something that was in vogue, I know for me it's always been an uphill climb to be recognized, to find work, to find valuable work where I could give back and be compensated accordingly. It's never been something that I've been handed. It's always been something that I've worked for. So I know a lot of companies have worked really steadfastly since 2020 in sort of assembling an image of what, if they didn't have a DEI plan, they threw one together. When they looked at, there are certain companies I know that were highlighted in 2020 that the amount of Black employees at the company was really embarrassingly low, and so
Right.
they started to make all of these public statements about well, we're going to do better and this is our timeline. TD included in that. They're doubling their Black executives by the end of the year. They started off with about 15, so by the end of the year we're going to be up to 30 in a company of 90,000. It's sort of alarming to me. So what's your impression, Ikem, on companies who are rushing to throw a strategy up, but not really looking at the nuances of perhaps taking time to create these strategies, to meet with the people in your company and get a sense of what's really going on, and doing it in more of a timely manner that's more effective than just throwing something together. What are your thoughts on that? And I'd like everyone else to
Yeah.
chime in on that too, if you have anything to say.
Yeah, as a black man, as a strategist, the short answer for me is stop. We as communities that have over generations been victimized by a lot of the same policies, we can tell the difference. We can tell, we know who has been a part of these conversations and who has been putting in earnest effort to actually make change within their organizations. I find it remarkable that George Floyd's murder, it became such a seminal moment in this conversation. It wasn't the starting point of police-involved killings in the United States or in Canada or anywhere else in the world. It wasn't the starting point of any of the things that we point to and see that now as a watershed moment for this sort of. I've seen it described as like a reckoning that is happening now. We're talking about generations of abuse and dehumanization and laws and policies that were happening until 30 minutes before George Floyd was killed, right? It's so, but that, and there have been several other people who have been killed before and since George Floyd. So I think, in essence, I struggle with accepting that as the reason you have now come to the dance. However, since we have been saying for generations, come to the dance and fix what you broke, you are now here. My job and the sort of citizen in me says, how can we work together to make sure that if you're actually here to be educated and do this work properly, let's do that. If you're here to perform, that's visible to us as well. We will inform you when we have the kind of relationships that make it both worth it and safe to inform you that that what you're doing is performative. If you're not ready to do the work, here's how you can get ready, or don't pretend to be doing it. I think there is a certain agency that we as Black folks and Black communities need to continue to exercise, because even though we have been asking and marching and protesting and putting in work to change this, that doesn't mean that we should be open to accepting the lowest, the least viable product that some of these companies and organizations can put forward as their entry into the conversation that we've been living through and dying as a result of for centuries.
Did anyone else want to chime in and sort of piggyback on that idea?
Yeah, if I may, Nick, just to get back to what was mentioned before. So the question of representation, we know how this is not enough. We know this is not enough. This is only the visible part of the iceberg. And when addressing racism within organization and institution, we need to work at the foundations to allow sustainability and duration and profound change. And the most important thing is always to center people who are concerned and make sure that they are set up for success as well. So it also means having providing resources, human resources and financial resources that will reflect a real commitment to the work that is being done. And as Ikem mentioned, performativity is it's obvious to people from the community, right? Like it's very obvious. And I think this is also something that had been mentioned among our conversations before, but having people who are concerned, who know exactly what we're talking about in decision-making positions is also crucial.
Yeah,
I agree. I think those in the position to hire. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. There's a delay, so I'm like, I don't know when the. I think Karen brought up a really good point about what's happening at the core. That a lot of people have used DEI as like an addition and not a tool for structural change, because the systems that currently exist are the ones causing us harm. So it doesn't really matter how many more you add, how many more Black people you add, how many more POC that you add, how many more Indigenous voices that you add. You're adding them to a structure that is built on harm towards visible minorities. So if we're using DEI, like, and suddenly all of these resources exist in order to implement these new committees and all those things, it's like you could be actually funneling all of those resources, because we all hear about the excuse that it's too expensive to be inclusive. But you could be circumventing those resources to the structural change and really evaluating that. If all of the companies I've been doing DEI work for, if they were integrating our teachings into the foundational structure of the business, the result would be more diversity. The result would be inclusivity. Coming in and being like, we are doing inclusivity now, it just doesn't actually make a lot of logical sense. And that's because the people in power are the ones trying to determine how to be anti-racist. But those people in power are the catalyst of racism, whether they know it or not. And so we need to really be taking a step back and replacing certain people in power and replacing certain structures, starting at the board. But it's not only about representation at the board, it's about what those people that are coming in, what their values are, what their intrinsic ideas of structural change are. And that should be determining who we hire, and that should be determining how everybody else gets hired. And yeah, so we can talk about policies and things like that, but if you're building on top of a structure that's already broken, then everything you build on top of it will also break. And there's a few ways to do it. Like, there's a few ways to change the structure. I think the board is probably the first place to do it when it comes to replacing people. But then also taking a look at the pyramid structures that we have all been taught are the way to go, and really seeing what it looks like in the inverse and kind of operating at that level, and figuring out and reevaluating the value that the lowest part of the pyramid is actually bringing in. There's a big difference between integration and inclusion. Integration keeps Black and brown folks on the outside, on the periphery, without changing the core, which is usually a homogenous being of ideas, identity, and truth. And integration is really mixing that up, where you see diversity throughout the entire organization instead of just on the posters on the outside.
I like what you said there in terms of, I'll bring it to you, Nneka, in just a quick second, but I just wanted to call out what you said there in terms of turning the paradigm around. So one of the things that thoughts that triggered in my head was, change always starts from the most common thing, the lowest level. So if you look at something very, very remarkable and well known is like the bus boycotts in the would have been the 50s, in the 60s in the American South, is that they held the power. So they said, don't take the bus for X amount of time. We're going to, kind of cut the city off at its knees. And if they don't get any ridership, then it's going to affect your bottom line, and then you have to give in, and that did end up happening. So it reminded me of that. So I think you're right, is that we have to turn it on its head, and we've got to look at we the people to say and to realize that we actually hold the power. I think, but the question is, how does that happen, and what are the steps to get us there, and what would something like that look like? Because I think we're all in agreement when we look at corporations, a lot of what's being done is sort of just face value. So there's no core dynamic paradigm shift that's changed. And I agree with you. The people at the top we need to have people at the top who recognize that and who want that change to happen. My supposition is that a lot of heads of companies they're profit minded. And if they knew, to your point, Allison, you had mentioned yesterday offline, that I think you had said if we don't pay attention to DEI, then companies will suffer profit wise. So I think it's also bringing that to attention to a lot of these leaders to say, if you don't, like, you have no choice. If profit is your end, then you need to include all of us. Absolutely. Neka, sorry, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with what Alison and Karen mentioned about, building on a broken structure will just lead to the same outcome that we are working against. A step that organizations can do in the right direction will be for them to review their programs, policies, and practices. They could start by breaking out areas that and reviewing them and identifying those processes and policies that are anti-racist or anti-oppressive. They could start with their employees. What are their recruiting and hiring policies? What are their benefits and work conditions? Do they give their employees opportunities for learning and growth? And when they do this, they would start by learning what is wrong, first of all, in the system, and then start the steps to try and fix them. And it's okay to make mistakes along the way. You don't have to be perfect 100% when you start out. So it will be good to review after a period of time to look at what has been done right, and then you back up for those that haven't been done right, and then think of doing it them all over again. It's what I've observed with DEI is that is a gradual process because, like Ikem had mentioned, this is generational hurt and trauma that has been done, and it can't be taken care of overnight. It is slow and gradual, and it's a learning process for everyone. Racialized community groups in the team, and also everyone on the team, actually.
That's great insight. That's lovely. One of the things that came to mind is the idea of, Allison, you had mentioned that sometimes we are seen as a monolith, just one group, and the idea of this is a sort of a colonial idea, but the idea of dividing and conquering. So when you go into a space, right, you might look at the Black experience, but then it becomes detrimental to the Indigenous experience. And there are very few companies in my experience that do that balance really, really well. But a lot of it, I feel, is sort of, again, I think it's speaking to the overall grassroots strategy and a continuous review of what's been established to point out the gaps, knowing that, I like what you said, Nick, about it, companies will make mistakes. And I think we have to be forgiving to a point to say, okay, mistakes are made. You spoke out of turn, you did this or that, but we can move forward, but, make sure that we carry that forward. And I find sometimes the block can be pride. I think that when you hold a mirror up to somebody, and I've learned this in my own personal life, as a young person, I was really defensive. Like, if you criticize me as a young person, I would, my back would be up. But what I've learned over time is that is actually an opportunity for me to self-evaluate and not necessarily agree, but to sort of just self-evaluate. And I find sometimes when we have conversations around race or equity or justice in corporations, sometimes the response on surface might be, I hear what you're saying, but the follow through might not be there, or it would be sort of, well, you're blaming me for something. But how important, for Karen, maybe you can take this, how important is it to acknowledge the past and what has been done, and how do we communicate that in an effective way? And I won't say without offending somebody, because sometimes, feelings will be hurt, or people, or, wounds will be open. but how do we acknowledge why we want equity and justice, and how do we do that to the people who are currently in power, to say these are the reasons why? How do we plead for that? How do we ask for that? How do we demand that?
It's a tough question, Nick, but what I would start by saying, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier, I think like setting the ground the proper way is very important. And as Nika mentioned, the work, the anti-racist work being done at institutional and organizational level is pretty new, and therefore it's difficult. Resistance is inherently connected to the work that is to EDI anti-racism work in general, and we need to come to a point where we acknowledge that resistance is part of the process, and that this resistance is not necessarily a threat, but rather an opportunity to do better. So when it comes to like in talking about my position as program manager on the plan to address, on the action plan to address anti-Black racism at McGill, what we have at heart, and it's to make sure that McGill as an institution remains more inclusive, as well as being able to maintain academic excellence. And when one of the first steps in doing this work was to kind of redefine what excellence means. And excellence is not excellence if it's not inclusive, because you're basically not tapping into an existing pool. So I do think that taking a step back, coming back to what is our interest as an organization and as an institution, and based on that, making sure that we make the proper diagnostic of what is best for the organization and institution. And so just to go back to what I was saying earlier, I think allowing a space for humility and for listening to existing problems and concerns is crucial. You need to have that. You need to be able to be vulnerable. You need to acknowledge past mistakes to do better. It's like crucial, and sometimes it's difficult because those conversations are difficult, and not everyone is comfortable with resistance in general and with conflict. So yeah, but if we take a step back, if we kind of center what are the interests that we have at heart, maybe we can engage in it in a different path, in a better path, basically.
I think, Ikem, did you want to chime in? You were nodding in agreement to what Karen was saying.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think resistance will come if hand in hand with doing some of this work. I think I guess a combination of time, getting older, being in this part of the world for longer, where I am now in my career. I think my level of patience with the defensive posture is reducing quite rapidly. Now I hope that I'm still being quite as gracious as I ought to be when we're having these kinds of conversations, but I think I've had enough. There's a friend and a mentor of mine. He's a Black man. He does some really interesting equity work in the United States, Michael McAfee, and he says that he has a lot of rage in him, a lot of anger in him because of the plight and the experience of Black and brown and poor people in the United States, and he brings that anger with him into his work. It fuels his relentlessness and his desire to create the change that he knows is possible in his lifetime, right? And that's sort of the approach that I have. Is I feel that the resources are available. I feel like the intellect is in the room. I think what is lacking is the willingness, in some instances, not all the time, is the willingness to take risks on this particular issue. I think there's a certain level of discomfort. When I moved here and I was studying political science, one of the things that I learned that Canadians sometimes define themselves as is that we are not American. So, but that doesn't give you a definition of what and who a Canadian is. But I think the difference, how that plays out, is that becomes the defense. Is when we talk about racism and we talk about the experience of blackness in Canada. In some cases, the pushback is that, well, it's not as bad as it is in the United States, or like, you know, George Floyd is not Canadian, or all of those kinds of things become part of the narrative. And I like to say that there isn't a force field in Buffalo. There's nothing. We consume the same media. We have a lot of the same culture between Canada and the United States. So it's not acceptable that there is this thing that has changed once you cross that border, and we are now two very different people, right? So I think I am willing, and in more cases, to be able to be a bit less accepting of a slower timeline or a more deliberate, like, let's take a pause, because I know that at least in my line of work, we talk a lot about, you know, rapid prototyping, failing fast, and learning and building from what you've learned. I think, yes, we need to give space and grace for people to make mistakes and come back from those mistakes and do better. But there also has to be a willingness to attempt to change things that are hard. So, you know, we're attempting to change things around climate. We're attempting to change things around so many complex and big things in our lives. We can have a conversation that leads to action around race that is not followed by, well, can we slow down so that we don't offend people, or that we don't make things uncomfortable for those things to happen. Life for many of us as Black folks is a daily slalom around uncomfortable situations that we have all developed, you know, code switching and defense mechanisms and armor that allow us show up on a day-to-day basis in the workplace, in our romantic relationships, and just you know, putting your recycling out on the street, right? So I think it's time that we continue to invite our neighbors and coworkers to journey with us a little bit more, you know, in the nude, in experience, and some of what it feels like to do this work, and actually put a little bit of effort and willingness to go all in it.
Yeah, go ahead, Allison.
That was really well put, and I love when I see my kinfolk own their anger, because it's like, it's just well deserved, you know. It's like I remember watching one of my favorite comedians, Michael Che, talk about how he always thought that depression was just for white people because it means that you don't have a reason to be upset. And, and he's just like, what's that like? And that always resonated with me when it talks about owning our anger and understanding that the anger we have is justified. And when people try to silence that anger, they're silencing so much more than anger. But I digress. One thing I wanted to kind of reflect on what Karen was saying about, and about what Nick was saying about kind of that room of grace, or that room of forgiveness. I think we have to be careful not to individualize and humanize organizations, because there's a reasonable expectation that an organization is a group of minds creating decisions. So the only way an organization is making decisions that are exclusive to everybody, it means that the body of that organization has one thought process. So that's where lack of diversity shows itself. So when I see an organization, especially large organizations, and they're coming out with statements, policies, procedures, things like that, that are exclusive, it shows me who's not in the room every single time. And I just think that the expectation that we have for fallible humans does not translate to organizations, because even my organization has to be perfect if we want funding. We have to be perfect, right? But me as a human being, I cannot maintain that. And if we don't separate organization from people, then the reverse happens as well, where my human mistakes end up being scrutinized as if it's an organizational mistake, which is not true, right? So yeah, conflating the two can be really harmful for visible minorities, especially because a lot of us choose the entrepreneurial route because there's nothing out there for us. We have to invent it. And then we have to go to larger organizations and prove our worth to exist along them without any of the tools and resources that they have. So all we are able to prove ourselves with is our character and our ideas and our humanity. So for my own strength and my own perseverance, because I've been doing this work since 2012. I'm much older than I look, but I've been doing this work for a minute, and I only started getting paid for it a year and a half ago.
Wow.
So yeah, so when we're talking about equity within organizations as well, you're bringing in people who are doing DEI work. If they just started, that ends up in very different results than honoring the folks who have been doing this work for decades. As Ikem was saying, like, this has been happening for centuries. You know, these folks have been out here for a while. And so when we're talking about acknowledging the past, let's acknowledge that past. Let's find the organizations that have been doing this work and consult them and contract them. If you have the resources to create your own internal team, the people that work in that organization should not be in charge of creating those teams, because they're the ones making the errors. You know, like, we've seen this in American politics, what happens when you fire the FBI agent that's looking into you. You know what I mean? Like, so we can't heal in the places where we're harmed. Yeah, and that's really what equity work is. It's an opportunity for healing. It's changing systems so that healing can happen. And the healing aspect of DEI is everyone, is absolutely everybody, because everybody's affected by white supremacy. But if you look at the people that are most affected by it, that still persevere to do this work, that's the gospel right there. So, like, I want to see these big companies bringing in groups like in Calgary, like, I mean, I'm obviously on a local level thinking about it, but like Action Dignity, who's been out here since 71, you know, like groups that have been doing this work for a long time. And I'm part of the new group, respectively, right? Because even though I've been doing this for like a decade, that's nothing compared to these other groups. And like, where is their time in the sun? They should be benefiting from this social shift as much as anyone else.
I think that is such a relevant statement, because I could speak from the point of view of TD, huge company. We've been around for, you know, over 100 years, and we've been doing it DEI work probably for the last 22 years or so. We started to really put a focus on that because our CEO at the time, I think, had a gay child and saw a lot of the inequity that his child was experiencing and said, let's do something here. So that's how TD really became a force in this. However, having said that, to your point, Allison, I think a lot of companies don't get it right, again, because they're focusing on representation. So, you know, we sponsor Pride, we sponsor Black History Month, we do all of these things. And so on the surface, but really you're not doing what you need to do. And I've worked with a few organizations similar to what you're doing, and dissimilar in other ways, but organizations who have been around for a minute, who know what they're doing, who understand the nuances, and who can see the pitfalls and the gaps and kind of mend them. So then you have companies saying, but we've been doing it for a long time, so we know what we're doing, so don't worry, like we're good. Focus on the new ones coming into play. But that is not necessarily the case. And these large companies are forces to be reckoned with where it comes to financial power, because in the world that we live in, this is held to a candle's held to profit. It's hard to kind of dig in there and make those suggestions. At TD, a lot of the times you have Black executives who have been kind of put forward to be the face of, and they're sort of, you know, recycled continuously. And so one of the gaps for me is, where are we developing lower level Black employees to make sure that we reach those echelons? And to me, I haven't seen that. I'm still waiting for that. One of the ways I wanted to go with the conversation, and one of the triggers that I had, was the idea around exhaustion in terms of education for BIPOC people, people of color, Black people. I personally find it exhausting. Like as was mentioned before by Ikem, it is exhausting to continuously educate. It seems like during 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, I was really upset that the world started to pay attention, and I'm like, you should have been paying attention from way back, but suddenly here. So that was kind of a weight on me, and then sort of encountering, my partner is a white man, and so this is just a quick example. So we, with George Floyd, he was really upset about what happened, perhaps on my behalf, perhaps on, you know entering this world with a person of color and riding with them and seeing through my eyes the world in a different way. So he said, if we're ever stopped by the cops, I'm really going to give it to them. I'm really going to, like, I'm not going to, I don't like the way cops, operate in some spaces, in some cities, in some neighborhoods. And I want to change the status quo. And I said, not with me in the car. Mm-mm. Not with me. If I'm in the passenger seat, I would suggest that you not do that. And then having to explain, that's my partner. I don't mind explaining and educating. I think that's really important. But I want to hear from each of you what it's like, what you're expecting. Maybe you don't mind, educating and explaining. But I personally am. I'm tired. But what has been your experience within companies, outside of companies, in your personal lives, with having to be the educator constantly, and how has that affected your life, Karen?
Well, I think the response to that is pretty obvious. It's exhausting to be the only one talking about how anti-racism is important and crucial and concerns everyone. So it's definitely exhausting. What I wanted to talk about, and what I wanted to mention, is that we're dealing with like something that is very complex and very difficult, and we need complex approaches and complex responses, and we need people who have been at the forefront of this work to be centered once again. And what I want to say as well is that we're talking about like those examples of how like it's very tiring for people of color to educate around anti-racism and EDI and so on. But really the question is that we're talking about organizational change in general. So we even though we're talking about those pieces that are very at different places, what we're talking in general is about organizational and structural change. And for that, we need to have transversal approaches. So when we were discussing hiring policies, for example, and hiring practices, you need to have representation at every level, and you need to have initiatives that are hosted in very different places within your organization. So you cannot have like one DI working group developing strategy around anti-racism or EDI for the whole organizations, because the buy-in will not be there. And the accountability mechanism is not there either. So going back to that question of exhaustion, the burden should be felt by everyone and not just people of color, basically. So, and for that, you need to make people understand at the global level that this issue is not only the question of like BIPOC folks, basically. It's everyone's problem.
I agree with you, Karen.
That's amazing. Well said.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a self-guided work, so it's everyone's responsibility to learn. There are lots of material online. There are lots of people shared stories and lived experiences that can be gotten. I believe that staff members that are people of color should be given the option to share their lived experiences, and then the organizations learn from them and will be guided by them. But I think I agree with Nick and Karen, it's exhausting where, often we are called upon to help navigate issues, and it's like the responsibilities on us. So it's a double oppression. And I can tell you, even sharing my lived experience most times is exhausting. So I think it's everyone's responsibility in the organizations to actually educate themselves.
I think it's also important to note that almost all civil rights changes and leadership has been on the backs of Black women, and that's including Black trans women, especially being one of the most targeted groups, especially in the States. And so any work that Black women do outside of that, outside of DEI work, is it's as if your workday doesn't end, because that teaching and that upholding, it doesn't stop. When I do panels and I do workshops and stuff with groups, I think the largest group I've ever facilitated is like 210 people. It was a lot, but I really want to ask the men in this group if they experience this as well. But the most amount of work that happens after that, because I can go through a deck, I can go through a presentation, I bring in facilitators. Sometimes it's fun, it's always like fulfilling. This does feel like my purpose, so it's exhausting, but it's also fulfilling. But what happens after is people from the facilitation groups continue with the contacting and the questions and asking for resources and not really lifting a finger themselves. They're like, oh, I found a Black person that's going to do this for me. And that's the trend that I see the most, where I get exhausted because I'm just like, the billable hours have ended. There is an expectation. So I really want to know if like the Black men also experience this on the high level, because I don't know if that's just it's easier to approach Black women about this because we lift it all anyways.
Yeah, I totally agree.
What are your thoughts?
I totally agree on that notion of the emotional unpaid labor, and that's the incidence of that tax is definitely higher on Black women and women whom identified. I think that on that fatigue, I think it is shared. We find different ways to carry it, mask it, offload it in healthy or unhealthy ways. There has to be an outlet for it somehow. And that becomes part of unfortunately the labor. Unfortunately becomes a re-victimization of that person and that body to be able to carry this learning. I was sharing when we were getting into the conversation that I'm quite grateful in the organization that I am right now, is that all of the learning and conversation that's been happening around Black History Month has been led by white people. It has been organized by my colleagues have, at least to my knowledge, no one has asked me to contribute, design, or present anything. I did make myself available actually last year when we were having some conversations, sort of along the lines of there's a guy, Emmanuel Acho, who does this thing called the Conversations. I think it's Candid Conversations with a Black Man, and I offered myself to my colleagues and said, anybody that wants to have a conversation with me, has any questions that they want to ask from any perspective about race, they can ask me. And I will give them my perspective as just one Black person who works in this organization. I think that that level of work exists completely outside of like Alison just said, the sort of the billable hours, right? It changes your relationship with the people that you work with. Because sure, we can come and have a conversation in a session about race and the impacts of race. But just remember that we've, as Black people, we're dealing with this from the moment we woke up. Mm-hmm. All of the things that we navigate around, how much noise we can make in our homes, what we're going to wear to work that day, the experience of commuting into work, what we eat in the cafeteria, what our food smells like in the lunchroom. All those things are aspects of the experience of living in a racist soup that we deal with before we step into that session, before we start writing or delivering that deck about how you build a less racist society or how you build an anti-racist team. So it's not a room that you enter into and then let's talk about racism, and once we're done we go out and that's all fine and good. The sort of social movements and the social reckoning around all of this has heightened all of that, because now that is all that ever. I mean, when George Floyd was killed, or when all of the other people, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, all of them, when those happened, the conversations that people want to have with you sort of get into that mode of like, how are you feeling? How are you really feeling? Should I have asked you last year or not? And it creates some tension. So I had to have some really I had a very frank conversation with some of my some friends and neighbors of mine. I asked them point blank, their parents as well. I have young children. And I asked them in the middle of one of these conversations, I kind of got emotional. I'm like, how are you raising children that are not going to grow up to kill mine? That is where we need to go and end up going if these conversations are going to go out of, let's talk about how to change the design of a form or how many ways we can identify inclusion as a list, and make it personal. This is personal for us. The experience of racism is personal, it is professional, it knows no boundaries. So why should the solution be bound by a workday or a contract or something in my job? I don't experience it only at work. And it's something that I have been seeing floating around recently on the internet. Is like a joke kind of about the fact that one of the mistakes we've made with racism, with slavery, is telling it as Black history as opposed to white history. I think we can start to talk about that as well, about racism. This is not just our history. This is humanity's history. This is the history of what has been done to us and continues to be done to us. So why should the burden of creating anti-racist teams, stem from those who have been victimized by it and those who have, quite frankly, in many cases, have the least to gain by starting the conversation? They might have the most expertise to offer in solving the problem, but that doesn't mean that they ought to be the ones to ignite that conversation and catalyze that change within the organizations that they work in.
Well said. Well said. There are so many nuggets there, and I saw Allison nodding her head at points, and but there's so many things to kind of take apart there. I know time is limited, and we're almost at time. But just in keeping with the theme of exhaustion, I think that's really poignant because these companies, and I agree with you, Kem. I think the people um, who run these companies, the onus is on them to get educated, and us doing it consistently and constantly, I think, is exhausting to us. So I think we're all in this together. We all have a stake in this to make sure that we get it right. Um, but in terms of exhaustion, when 2020 happened, one of the things that I realized just as an individual is how much pain I carry in my body, and in my mind at somewhere at a deeper level. And I always thought to myself, perhaps it's generational pain, perhaps it's something deeper. So we haven't. I've, in my personal opinion, as Black people, I don't think many of us have reckoned with what the trauma that we've been through over centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries. And I think it culminates. And I think it's really important for us, let alone, in conjunction with other people, for us to unpack all of the things that we hold within us that are negative and standing in our way. And I think that the lens with which we use to see the world is really important. I think for many of us is sort of changing that out. Something really simple is like, I matter. And a lot of, when I think of 2020 and I think back there's so many things that I suppressed, whether it be microaggression, overt aggression, that I've just repressed. And 2020 for me gave me permission, as you see companies reacting and wanting to build anti-racist teams. One of the things that came to the fore for me and the realization was how much I held inside that I didn't even know I was dealing with. As an example, walking into the room and the energy of the room changes because you're the only person who looks like you. Or for me, it's the ambiguity of being Black. In some spaces, I'm not Black enough. In some spaces, I'm too Black. And so it's all of those little, or the assumptions about one of the deepest things I think is for me is what is so insidious about our history is this, is that we sometimes as Black people buy into what we've been given over years and years and years, and it plays out in different ways. And one of the examples, a Black friend was saying, I was walking down the street and I saw a group of young Black boys and I wanted to avoid them. And I said, why? I said, what are you talking about? He's just walk past them. You can walk past a group of Black boys. But they said to me, the images that conjure up in my head based on what I've absorbed in my life tells me that I will be in peril, I will be in danger if I walk towards that group. So how insidious it is, and all of the weight that we're dealing with, is when we look sometimes at our own people, we experience we're looking at ourselves, but we're fearful of our own self. And that may be getting a little too deep, but I think the point is that we hold so much. How do we, in order to move change forward, how do we then deal with our own demons? And we're all dealing with them. And this is over centuries. This is over time. How do we reconcile it? How do we deal with it? And that's a deeper conversation, and it goes beyond working in companies and how to build anti-racist themes. And maybe I've gone off on a tangent, but I think that's really important as a people ourselves, is to really reconcile where we are at emotionally. I think that's so important. At least it is for myself. Let's do a round table, and we'll give the last words to everyone in terms of contribution as we end this beautiful hour. And I'd like to start with Karen.
Thanks, Nick. Just to comment on what you said, I think another important thing that we need to kind of remember all the time is that we are a product of a society and of an environment. So it's always something that we should keep in mind. And maybe just as just to finish on that, maybe what I will share is just I will drop some words that I find I think important based on the conversation that we had. So I would say that vulnerability resonates a lot with me. Sustainability in terms of initiatives and everything that we are kind of trying to implement. Transversal approaches in general as well in the work that we're doing. And I would finish with accountability to the community and to the people that we serve. This would be my last words. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Karen. Allison?
I guess my closing remarks would be just for my community, present included, that we're not a burden. We're worth fighting for. That's why we're out here. To do this work, there has to be a level of understanding that we are worth this fight, and we're not gonna stop. And if anybody ever tries to tell you that your wellness is an inconvenience, that person doesn't want you to be well. And organizations that use our language, like inclusivity, equity, diversity, but they are not prioritizing your wellness on every level, then they need to be held to account, because we're not a burden. We're not an extra. We're not an addition. We're not something to take care of. We are fundamental proponents of culture, beauty, Black joy, art, everything. So we should be protected. Our wellness should be a priority, or else, you just have hot dogs for the rest of your life. So we need to be protected, and this fight is worth it.
Well said. Nneka.
Right. So my closing remark is that we need to take time to heal. And for organizations out there that are starting the work, that are already on this journey, you all and we all need to hold ourselves accountable for our policies, our actions to the community, to our employees. And it will be a good and great idea to see yourselves as a safe space, the organizations as a safe space for employees to be vulnerable, and also, hold hands, and continue this journey. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nneka. Ikem.
For me, I would say let's work better together. Let's learn better together. We say something in my fraternity, which is a historically black men's fraternity. We say he ain't heavy. That is to say that regardless of what weight it is my brother brings, and that is all of humanity, my sisters, my community, that's not too heavy. I can carry it. And I can carry it because I know people who can help me carry it. I know people who can help me share that load. That's the philosophy that I think gets us to actually build teams that are not, I love the fact that our title is not building teams that are not racist. It's building anti-racist teams. And that suggests a struggle. It suggests that you're fighting against something that you recognize is incorrect. And I think that weight is something that we can carry and share together and give back the trauma and the hurt and the pain that does not belong to us. And be great.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ikem. This has been a really educational hour for me. Holding space with all of you has been a blessing for me today, and I hope you all feel the same way. What a pleasure. I wanted to piggyback off what Allison said. My wellness is not an inconvenience, and that's something that I'll hold and carry with me. A wonderful reminder. And one of the things I wanted to say in terms of companies, and I hope they can learn this as we move forward, is that what affects one of us affects all of us. And I think, carrying a little bit of that in terms of going forward, if you bring to light, this is going to affect you too, people then jump and they move. And it is the ultimate truth. So thank you all for holding space today, and happy Black History Month.